Scientists are sounding the alarm. According to the latest estimates, by the end of the century, the average temperature on Earth will rise by almost 3 degrees. This could lead to a global catastrophe. The media are overflowing with talk about how hard life will be in 50 years, as if it's easy today. We're asked to consume less, sort our trash, and generally treat nature more consciously. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's just one problem. We're so obsessed with the climate of the future that we don't want to sort out the past at all. And what if I tell you that just 300 years ago, our world was living through a real ice age? There were no mammoths, no sabre-toothed tigers or lisping sloths, but there was a lot of snow, drought, and tragedy. Human tragedy. Many people remember their school history textbook as a chronicle of endless wars and political upheavals. This video is also about history, but through the lens of nature. I'll explain how the Little Ice Age and climate in general reshaped people's lives and the prospects of the whole world. Fans of episodes about the Habsburgs and the Vatican, rejoice. This video has plenty of the Middle Ages, with the horrors of the Black Death and the Great Famine. We'll figure out how capitalism and big cities appeared. And if you watch this episode to the end, you'll look very differently at a banal but very important idea about who we are. You're watching History's Omitted, where stories don't just get told, they finally get explained. So, let's once again travel to our beloved Dark Middle Ages. The 14th century is considered the worst century in the history of Europe, not only because of all the horror that happened there. The contrast also played a role. The 3 centuries from the 10th to the 13th were a small golden age. Despite all the wars, the beginning of the Crusades and other misfortunes, the common man never lived so well as in that period. Let's say you live in a village somewhere in England, for example near Ipswich. Your village doesn't depend on other settlements. Everything you need, you produce yourselves. You break your back on the fields, but there's always something on the table. Your whole life depends on the field. You've probably heard legends that in earlier times, Europe often suffered from famine. But here, something strange is happening. Maybe people used to be lazy and work less, because neither you nor several generations before you have ever faced frosts in May. You harvest 2 crops of grain a year. Within your short 30-year lifetime, the population of your village has doubled. Some rich man nearby decides to build a monastery to plant vineyards and make wine. Sounds like we're not on foggy Albion at all, but somewhere in the south of France. Today in Britain, it rains every other day, and there are very few sunny days. The point is the climate. From the 10th to the 13th centuries, Europe and the whole northern hemisphere lived in an era of triumphant global warming. The average temperature was about 1.5 degrees higher. It sounds trivial. 1.5 degrees, not 40. But that very difference decided whether peasants would drink wine or start dying of hunger. For this reason, the heroes of the age were the Vikings. When it just started warming in the 9th century, the population of Scandinavia began to grow quickly. They plowed land up to the Arctic Circle, but it still wasn't enough. So when Vikings looted or went to serve in Constantinople, they weren't doing it from a good life. In modern terms, their real unemployment, taking into account the hidden part, was very high. There was no work, so you had to hustle. Another bonus from Mother Nature. The seas around Iceland and Greenland were relatively free of ice. And thanks to this, the Vikings could first reach Iceland and from there push on to Greenland. There's a myth that the Viking Eric the Red, colonizer of Greenland, literally named the island Greenland to lure more settlers there. That's a PR trick. He might have lied a bit, but only a bit. The weather was such that green meadows stretched along the coast. At the time, the largest Greenland settlement had, for a moment, about 4,000 people. For comparison, that's only slightly less than lived in Belgian Ghent or French Marseille then. And from Greenland, it's a stone's throw to America. And it's important to understand, the Vikings didn't just discover America, look around, and sail away. No, they went there regularly. And on the island of Newfoundland, which they called Markland, the land of forests, they harvested timber for the Greenland colonists. In more southern Vinland, the land of wine, now Nova Scotia and Canada, there was a whole colony. What was happening in the rest of Europe? Today, both Turkey and Spain are rather dry places. But thousands of years ago, they were watered by constant rains. The clearest example is the Italian island of Sicily. Here are two old bridges crossing what now looks like a puddle or a tiny stream you can step across. But that's today. Back then, generations depended on these bridges. Full flowing rivers ran here, navigable for boats. And in our little sketch of the English village, I mentioned population growth for a reason. For that era, it was a phenomenon. Usually out of 6 newborns, half died within the first year of life. In the early 10th century, Europe had about 35 million people. 400 years later, the population had doubled. And this without medicine and agricultural technologies that caused a giant leap in the 20th century. The reason was climate. In some regions, the demographic boom was downright wild. England grew 3.5 times in 250 years. France showed the same picture. In the early 14th century, French villages were as densely populated as in the early 20th century. Urbanization was different, of course, but you have to admit, it's impressive. The cities themselves also kept up. If you didn't live in a giant metropolis like Constantinople, with several 100,000 inhabitants, your town was probably very self-sufficient. Neighbors practiced crafts, fields of wheat outside the walls, or right in the yards fed you. You didn't have to terrorize villages just to survive. We'll come back to that point later. In Asia, the climate was also quite favorable, but the consequences were ambiguous. In Asia, including the steppes and deserts of Central Asia and Mongolia, the climate became more humid. The number of nomads grew a lot. That demographic wave was exactly what Genghis Khan rode. First, he wiped out his enemies across Asia, and then his heirs marched west to the last sea to Europe. Thank you, medieval climate optimum, that warm period I mentioned. But really terrifying things were happening in Central America. There, the highly developed civilization of the Maya, which, according to bold estimates, had up to 22 million people, died in agony. Starting from the 7th century, their city-states suffered from constant droughts. The warm climate only made things worse. Land became the key resource. Society was torn apart by wars for resources. The result? By the time Europeans arrived, many Maya cities stood empty, and the population had dropped to about 1 million. Whatever horrors were happening in America, for Eurasian inhabitants, this was an age of prosperity, a real golden age. But in just 100 years, nightmare would begin there too. Again, because of climate. We've already been talking about climate for 10 minutes, but we still need to understand what it actually is. How do you measure it? And how do we even know that climate used to be different? The Englishman Hubert Lamb was the first person to prove that climate over human history has changed significantly. He lived, by the way, in the 20th century. According to his definition, climate is the weather conditions in a given place over a limited period. Today, climate statistics are built on 30-year periods, so several cold winters in a row are not yet climate. Climate is data for, say, 30 winters in a row. Even ancient scholars understood that Earth's climate must have changed somehow over millions of years. But how much? Not everyone realized. We now know that the Earth has 3 times been fully covered in ice. These eras are called snowball Earth. That was long before complex life. And in dinosaur times, the climate leaned in the other direction. In the early Cretaceous, the last period of dinosaurs, the global temperature reached 27 degrees Celsius. Giant ferns grew in Antarctica. We know this from huge coal deposits. So 27 degrees? Is that a lot or a little? Well, today the planetary average is about 14. I already mentioned what a difference of 1.5 degrees can do, and even that isn't the ceiling. In the earliest post-dinosaur era, global temperature reached about 30 degrees. Some people start feeling bad at 25, and here it would have been hotter on average all year round. You'd have to live near the poles. Speaking of which, Antarctica looks like something eternal, always covered in ice. But as you understand, that's just an illusion. Now you can see that climate is an unstable, changeable thing. Why does it change at all? That's a complicated topic, not because nobody knows, but because there are too many factors. From algae activity to wobbles in Earth's orbit and changes in the sun's luminosity. I'm not a climatologist, but here's how popular authors explain it. First important factor, volcanic eruptions. They don't heat the planet, they cool it. Ash they throw into the atmosphere can lead to, say, a year without summer. We'll come back to volcanoes several times. Second factor, ocean currents. The main character of recent centuries is the warm Atlantic current, the Gulf Stream. Changes in its strength and direction radically alter climate across the whole Atlantic basin, including Europe. The medieval warm period was largely its doing. Finally, the composition of the atmosphere. Since the 1990 seconds, everyone knows carbon dioxide is bad because it causes the greenhouse effect while we breathe oxygen. But oxygen can also freeze the planet. That's your snowball Earth. So, last important question. How do we know it was that warm in the Cretaceous? It's not like a T-Rex had a thermometer in his tiny paw that could freeze and show us the temperature outside. With more recent times, everything is clear. By the 17th, 18th centuries, people already had weather vanes, rain gauges, thermometers, and barometers. And since then, they've kept careful climate records. As practice shows, not always accurate, but still. Another method is chronicles. In the Middle Ages, monasteries kept very diligent weather logs, and we understand fairly well what was going on in Europe in different eras. If monks write that grapes grow in England or on the Baltic coast, then the climate there must have been warm enough. Archaeology gives more clues. But how do we know what climate was like before people could write? That's where ice helps. If you take an ice core and look at its cross-section, you can see a lot of things, just like with tree rings. Where it grew faster, it was colder. Where there are microparticles of ash, there was a big eruption. 5 to 10,000 years can be studied like this. Speaking of trees, they help too. On their annual rings, temperature swings are very visible. There's even a term, fire scars. On the slice you see on screen, annual rings are visible, and the years when the tree survived, but the forest around it burned, show up as special marks. But there's a catch. To see this, you have to cut the tree down. And the oldest tree we know is just under 2,000 years old. Not great help if you're digging really deep. That's it. I won't overload you with more geoscience. The main thing is you now know all these numbers and theories are based on hard science. Earth's climate has always changed. These swings of cold and warm are like the planet's pulse. But a medieval peasant who'd never even heard the word climate couldn't grasp why tomorrow his entire crop would fail, and a month later he himself would start dying, and winter was coming. Even those who never watched Game of Thrones know the motto of House Stark: winter is coming. It's not just a reminder that December and all the deadlines are coming. It's more fun than that. In Martin's world, nature works differently. Summer can last 10 years, then autumn lasts just as long. Winter doesn't come for 3 months. It can drag on for years. The length of each season is unpredictable. If you're lucky, you can live a long life and never see winter at all. Why am I bringing this up? You can look at climate the same way the characters in Game of Thrones look at seasons. The 10th, 13th centuries are summer, and the very next century is a very real autumn. The usual suspect is the Gulf Stream, the Atlantic current we mentioned earlier. It started malfunctioning. It began to change direction, mix with cold currents. And the result was a new climate. Imagine being a Londoner in January 1310, when for the first time in history, you see the Thames frozen over. Not exactly a reason to go ice skating. All the city supplies came via the river, and ships were locked in ice. This led to bread freezing solid even when it was wrapped in straw. You couldn't eat it without reheating. The poor, who couldn't afford to heat their homes, huddled near bonfires, danced and hunted hares to survive. Danced. The Chronicle literally says so. No one thought of this catastrophe as the end of the world. How wrong they were. In the spring of 1315, unending rains hit all of Europe. Fields turned into swamps. Spring ended. June, July, August followed. Rain didn't stop. September was the same. Harvest was out of the question. People made the obvious conclusion. A new biblical flood had started. In some places, it really looked like that. In Central Europe, torrents of water washed away villages together with people. Hundreds, if not thousands, died. It was a catastrophe. Without crops, there was no grain. Prices shot into space, growing almost daily. And you know what's scariest? It wasn't just England. The whole of Europe, from Lisbon to Moscow, was starving. English King Edward II tried to manage the crisis. He banned using grain for alcohol, urged feudal lords and bishops to dump their grain reserves on the market to bring prices down and meet demand. But no one listened to the king. Even the elite went hungry. And that's not a figure of speech. Things got so bad that even King Edward had trouble finding bread. It's terrifying to imagine what was happening in the rest of the country. But we can look at paintings that depict the time. It's a ghastly sight. Cities suffered especially badly. We already said that earlier. They didn't rely so much on village produce. They grew a lot themselves. When starving peasants flocked to the cities, they found no salvation there either. One inhabitant of a Flemish city wrote that the moaning of peasants swollen from hunger, their curses and desperate cries could move stones. In what is now the Netherlands, people saw beggars clustering in large groups, rummaging through garbage outside city walls, or grazing like cattle in the fields. People died right on cultivated plots. Their bodies were buried in mass graves. The most desperate fought for life by any means, including immoral ones. Robbery and murder for a crust of bread became normal. Thieves stole everything, up to outright sacrilege. They tore the lead roofing off churches to sell it and buy food. And we're talking about deeply religious people driven to despair by weather. But the scariest thing was that 1,316 turned out even worse. Cold, snowfall, and constant rain decimated livestock. Sheep died first, then cows and oxen. Animals literally died from intestinal failure. Again, all across Europe. Even switching to meat became impossible. 1,316 began to be called the Year of Death. Everyone, regardless of status and age, died by the thousands every day. These events later went down in history as the Great Famine. It's very hard to count how many perished. Maybe 1 in 10, maybe even 1 in 4. Villages weren't much better off, but at least some people could live off hunting. Humans are adaptive and get used to everything. Livestock herds could be rebuilt, and the weather started to improve. Climate always fluctuates. Even with a cooling trend, warm years appeared when you could stock up. But then something happened that eclipsed even the Great Famine, the Black Death. And again, climate played a role. While Europe was drowning in waist-deep water, Central Asia was suffering a terrible drought. Herders had to drive their animals to new lands and move themselves. They reached European cities around 1,346 at the same time as the plague. Local populations simply had no strength left to resist. The generation born and raised during the Great Famine not only feared God's punishment, it also had weak immunity, all because of childhood malnutrition. When plague hit, they were up to 40 years old. Nowadays, we'd call them millennials. And they are the ones who started dying in droves. Another gift from Mother Nature, rats, which had infested cities since the Great Famine. They loved it there. In such chaos, there was plenty of garbage and corpses to eat. They could have just lived with humans and thrived. But during the pandemic, it was rats that became the main carriers of bubonic plague. Thanks, cooling. A similar story unfolded in the Far East. China and Japan were drowning in rain. Rats were forced to live closer to humans. Japan was saved by the fact that it sits on islands. In China, the death toll ran into the millions. What's the bottom line? By 1353, the Middle East and Europe had lost half their population. Every second person died, or every third, according to the most conservative estimates. In densely populated China, things were even worse. Mortality exceeded 50%. The 14th century was the worst time in the last 2,000 years. But the climate didn't care about people's suffering. The autumn of the Middle Ages, with its slush, rain, and snow, went on. And the horrors of the Great Famine repeated themselves 300 years later. The Vikings, with their constant passion for conquest, had a special attitude towards death. They believed the day and hour of death were predestined at birth. So there was no reason to worry too much. Only the way you leave life matters. And now we've reached the key stage of our episode. After the disasters of the first half of the 14th century, Europe slowly but steadily crawled into an era of cooling. Later, it would be called the Little Ice Age. From time to time, the continent was hit by harsh winters and true storms with thousands of victims. But compared to the Great Famine and Plague, no one even dared to mention that. Changes were gradual. By the end of the 14th century, vineyards on the southern Baltic had become a thing of the past. Alpine glaciers began to grow, forcing people down into the plains. Snow buried even Italy, as we know from Dante and Petrarch. But the main tragedy unfolded in Greenland. We left the local Scandinavians doing pretty well. Their colonies were growing and exploiting American resources. The worsening climate put everything in its place. If previously you could sail out of Greenland in summer, now the sea remained icebound even in summer. The Greenland Norse were left alone, cut off. It was a death sentence. In the 20th century, archaeologists found the ruins of one of the last houses of the Western Norse colony. The only thing they found inside was cow hooves. Everything else had been eaten. Everyone who could escape, escaped. The rest died of cold, hunger, or conflict with the Inuit. In Iceland, where the southern shore had almost never frozen before, polar bears now arrived on foot across pack ice. Icelanders weren't living there. They were surviving by hunting sea mammals. At the beginning of the 15th century, a thaw finally started. Coincidence or not, but this is exactly when Europe emerged from the Middle Ages. The early modern period began. Let's look at the map. Across Europe, we see the rise of cities and the Renaissance. Columbus sailed west, Bartholomew Dias sailed east, though both wanted to reach the same place. Further south, the Ottomans established power over proud Constantinople. Empires were doing fine in the east too. In China, the Ming dynasty ruled successfully and feared nomads like fire. In vain. The Gobi Desert was expanding, and no threat was expected from there. It seemed you could finally live again, but that was a false hope. A long winter was about to begin, and it would last 150 years. No one who had experienced the long warm period would live to see the end of this winter. It started in the mid-16th century. Temperatures dropped sharply. The first great winter came in 1565. The reaction was the same as during the first cold spell centuries earlier. A curiosity, an exotic anomaly. Painters captured it. The great Dutch artist Peter Bruegel the Elder painted his hunters in the snow. Look at the details. People are fishing, skating, and sledding on frozen lakes. No sense of apocalypse. People behave like kids who have been waiting for snow for ages and can finally play with it. Only by 1586 did the fun stop. Cold winters became frequent. Europe's temperature was about 2 degrees lower than today. People who'd never known electricity or wintering in Thailand or Bali suffered every season from blizzards and snowfalls. You could at least hide from the cold, but you couldn't hide from hunger. Historian Geoffrey Parker calculated that if the air temperature in Europe drops by even half a degree, the growing season shortens by 10 days. And there are scarier numbers. The chance that one of two crops fails doubles, and the chance that both fail increases sixfold. That's no longer about higher prices. It's about life and death. In the 16th century, famine returned to Europe. The population of Antwerp, then one of the richest cities in the world, dropped from 100,000 to 42,000. People fled hunger and Spanish rule north to Holland. The Spanish were hit too. They had the Invincible Armada, the largest fleet assembled to blockade the British on their damp island. But the plan failed. Not so much because of the English fleet, which scored a couple of successful but not crushing victories, but because of the climate. In August 1588, as the Armada rounded Scotland, it ran into a ferocious storm. The English coped with the weather, but Spanish ships were tossed onto the shore. In the end, half the legendary fleet ended up as timber on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Now for my favorite climate story. When I first heard it, I thought it was some hacky alt history fiction. Things don't happen like that in real life, do they? Oh, they do. Sudden jump to South America. Meet Huayna Putina, a large volcano in modern Peru. In 1600, there was a colossal eruption there, the largest since humans settled the region. The area covered by thick ash was about the size of modern Poland. For 10 days, the sun wasn't visible. A catastrophe, but a local one. The eruption was so powerful that in early autumn 1601, before harvest time, frost hit all of Russia. Most of the crop was lost forever. While Europe was freezing, Russia lost 15% of its northwestern population. The country entered the worst famine in its history. Urban dwellers could hardly get any food at all. Such periods were called more, pestilence. Eyewitnesses wrote that the sun and moon appeared reddish, pale and devoid of radiance. Daniel Schaller, a pastor from northern Germany, wrote, "Gardens and fields are tired of bearing fruit. Prices rise and famine comes. Groans and weeping are heard among peasants in villages and hamlets." China had its own tragic story. In the early 17th century, a wave of terrible droughts swept the empire. And here we return to Parker. As you remember, in a temperate climate, cooling turns agriculture into Russian roulette. In central and southern China, which are much warmer and wetter, the effect of cooling was worse. Rice yields were cut in half. That's beyond the survival line. The Ming Empire tried to fight this. It would have been better if they hadn't. Forced grain seizures triggered uprisings everywhere against the decaying dynasty. The final blow came from new nomads. They didn't come from the Mongolian steppes. As the Ming expected, the Manchus came from the northeast, regions of modern China, and overthrew the Ming, which just a couple of centuries earlier had been the greatest dynasty on the planet. No one rose to defend it. A volcanic eruption is total force majeure. In the 17th century, nature seemed to declare war on humanity. Large eruptions could happen twice a year. They didn't block out the entire sky, but each one shaved off part of the sunlight reaching Earth. In Northern Europe, winters were so cold that birds froze in midair. And even that wasn't the end. The long winter was entering its sharpest phase. The 50 years between 1680 and 1730 were the coldest part of the Little Ice Age. In England, the growing season was a month shorter than today. Amsterdam was buried in snow. For us, that sounds funny. But today, in January, it rarely gets colder than +4 there. Things were even worse for Greenland's Inuit, who had stayed after the Norse left. But the cold of the 17th century proved too much even for them. In 1685, strange boats were seen off the Scottish coast. News reached the local governor. The Finns have arrived. He was puzzled, came to see this wonder, and immediately realized they weren't Finns at all. These were Greenland Inuit who had just completed a 2,000-kilometer voyage across the Atlantic. In the 10th century, climate had pushed Vikings to discover America. In the 17th, Inuit discovered Europe. Meanwhile, real Finns were going through a catastrophe of their own. In the late 17th century, all Scandinavia was hit by another disaster. The harvest failed. The Swedes could just about feed the homeland, but for their territories in Estonia and Finland, they basically didn't care. As a result, Finland went through what local historians call the years of many deaths. A third of the population died of hunger. The lucky ones survived on fish. The rest switched to mushrooms and tree bark. About 500,000 people died, while the entire Swedish Empire had only about 2.5 million inhabitants. That's one reason Finns historically don't love Swedes. In southern Europe, things were better, but there were still lean years. Overall, disasters weren't as huge as 300 years earlier, with one big exception. In many developed states, such as France, there was already a bureaucracy that in theory could handle emergencies according to a template. In reality, between 1690 and 1720, France saw 182 food riots. A cocktail of bad management and bad climate did its work. In 1698, another poor harvest hit. The problem could have been solved by shipping grain from better regions to worse ones. Historians say the government could even have done nothing, and the crisis would have resolved itself. But we're not dealing with a random monarch. We're dealing with the Sun King Louis XIV. Besides huge expenses on Versailles, balls, and pleasures, he had another passion: war. In the 1,690 seconds, military spending ate a staggering 80% of the state budget. Money was always short, so they squeezed it out of peasants. Grain prices were driven to the ceiling. People spent everything on food. When hunger hit due to cold weather, things turned catastrophic. Ironically, the man on the throne at that moment was Louis XIV. Imagine, the population is dying of hunger, no money even for a loaf of bread. Burgundy's vineyards are freezing. What does the royal bureaucracy do? Squeezes even more money from the people. The state knew no mercy. One bishop described this scene. Peasants tried to hide their remaining grain, stuffing it even into pillows. But when tax collectors came, they seized tables, chairs, and underwear. While Louis enjoyed balls, and his generals led armies from victory to victory, on city outskirts you could see people literally eating nettles and carrion. Women and children were found dead on the roadside. Their mouths were often stuffed with inedible weeds. Many died not from hunger itself, but from eating things that couldn't be digested. Some historians argue that the famine under Louis was worse for France than the Great Famine of the 14th century. Over 2 million French people died. In total, in the 18th century, France endured 16 years of famine. One statistic underlines the Little Ice Age perfectly. Due to long-term malnutrition, the average height of an adult man from the 15th to the 18th centuries fell by almost 4 centimeters. And it wasn't just physical health that suffered. The Little Ice Age brought out the worst in people. It coincided with a major shift in values. After all the scandals of the Catholic Church, we covered them in the Vatican episode, society looked for a new, fair faith. Jan Hus, Martin Luther, and John Calvin tried to answer this request. Here's the key point. Up to the 17th century, conflicts between Catholics and Protestants weren't really wars of religious fanatics. The Habsburgs, for example, didn't fight because they were pious Catholics. Power was more important to them. Religion was just an attribute. The enemy was an opponent to be beaten, not exterminated. In 1555, the Peace of Augsburg introduced the principle, whose realm, his religion. Don't like living under a Catholic prince? You're free to go. But when the new wave of cooling came at the end of the century, conflicts grew hotter. Tougher living conditions and stressed agriculture sharpened the land question. Lutheran preachers called snowstorms and called God's punishment for sins. Catholic clergy did the same. You see where this leads? It's pure political propaganda. Your enemy is no longer just someone who prays differently. He's a creature whose existence condemns you to a cold and hungry death. Perfect soil for war. So when Bohemian nobles in 1618 decided they didn't want a Catholic king, they didn't negotiate. They threw the king's Catholic officials out of a window of Prague Castle. That's how the 30 Years' War started. A conflict where people inflamed by faith staged public massacres. The symbolic peak came in 1631. After capturing the Protestant city of Magdeburg, the Catholic army practically wiped out the entire population because they were sinners. Out of 30,000 inhabitants, at best 5,000 survived. There was another, purely material side. By then, armies were made, not of noble knights, but of mass levies, of ex-peasants. Because of the worsening climate, it became harder for ordinary peasants to feed themselves. It was easier to grab a pike and go kill others for pay, profit. After taking Magdeburg, Catholics happily wrote, "All our soldiers became rich men. God is with us." In the harshest phase of the Little Ice Age, legalized plunder became a great way to earn a living. And if someone is to blame for your cold and hunger, besides sinful heretics, it must be pagans, sorcerers, or more often, witches. Extremely convenient. The largest witch trials coincide with the worst natural disasters. Over 100,000 people were prosecuted for witchcraft from the late 16th to mid-17th centuries. 50,000 were executed, burned, or drowned. And it wasn't only Catholics. Protestants also eagerly hunted witches and pagans. Religion was the wrapping. Money was inside. Property of a condemned witch could be sold off cheaply. A real holiday. Better than Soviet dekulakization. The Little Ice Age sowed enmity all over Europe. Starving, freezing people were ready to kill neighbors for profit, and sometimes just to survive. God's glory was a handy slogan to silence any pangs of conscience. Another unexpected consequence of cooling was how it changed social structure. Since the Middle Ages, most land in Europe belonged to feudal lords of various ranks: counts, dukes, barons. Time passed, climate changed, and feudalism became less effective. The Little Ice Age was one of the reasons. If earlier, a peasant harvested, say, 5 measures of wheat and had to give a fixed 50%, 2.5, then after climate change, he might harvest only 3. The Lord now got just 1.5. The business model began to crack. At that point, merchants and burghers stepped onto the stage. Merchants earned super profits on trading and shipping colonial goods. For them, climate problems were not just a risk, but an opportunity. Thanks to global trade, famine's effects in advanced countries became less severe. A similar story played out with the bourgeoisie. For them, cooling was an even bigger chance than for merchants. Cold, lower agricultural yields and population growth created surplus people in the countryside. There was no place for them there. There wasn't enough land. They moved to cities, straight to urban workshops and early factories. Love at first sight. Capitalists got cheap labor. The workers didn't starve. This is how capitalism was forged. The process was uneven, of course. In Spain and Portugal, for example, even in the worst years, it didn't snow in May, so there wasn't the same flood of cheap labor into cities. Local land aristocracy could live more or less calmly. But the new climatic reality hit the Netherlands and Britain hard. Everyone has heard of Britain's Industrial Revolution, but people often forget about the Netherlands. Yet Dutch prosperity peaked right in the middle of the Little Ice Age. And the country was led not by landlords, but by merchants and burghers who benefited from climatic shakeups. Remember the famine in Antwerp? The city was devastated. But in the long run, sorry for the cynicism, the Dutch only gained. Thousands of skilled craftsmen and traders moved to Amsterdam. Because of climatic shifts, the commercial center of Northern Europe moved there. For a time, Amsterdam became the world's main trading city. The Dutch created a real global maritime empire and made breakthroughs in science and art. They also tamed their own land. Constant floods were beaten with dikes and polders. We talk more about that in our episode on megaprojects. The Netherlands is a country where power ended up in the hands of the new elite. In other places, the transition was bloodier. The first example is England. The old landed nobility clung to power and land even as their income collapsed. Eventually, it led to the English Revolution. The king accidentally lost his head, and a new nobility and bourgeoisie rose to the top. The second example is France. After everything Louis XIV put the country through, the atmosphere was explosive. In the late 18th century, the Third Estate, the bourgeoisie, seized power. The French Revolution. And voila, another king on the guillotine. Again, thanks in part to Mother Nature. By the 19th century, the Little Ice Age began to fade, slowly. No one flipped on central heating. Force majeure events still happened, like the famous Year Without a Summer in 1816 after the eruption of Tambora in Southeast Asia. That eruption gave conspiracy theorists an excuse to babble about a nuclear war in the 19th century. Today, the climate is changing again, because it always changes. That's a fact. Scientists argue over what exactly causes it and how big the human factor is. Columnists debate what matters more, economic growth or the planet's health. Some politicians say humanity has never cared so much about nature. Others insist it's nowhere near enough. Conspiracy theorists, as usual, think they are trying to trick us and cut the global population. To me, this whole discussion looks like the chicken and egg debate. Life's too short to keep up with all of it. Let's at least hope there won't be any truly massive volcanic eruptions, though we've already seen some in our lifetime. What I'd like to end on is this. While we were making this episode, I once again realized just how fragile our world is. Everything beautiful we have is the result of a chain of random accidents, and not always pleasant ones. So let's try to value what we have a little more. That's all for today. If you found this interesting, subscribe to the channel, hit like, and share this video with your friends, classmates, and colleagues. A new episode is coming very soon. Bye.